Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the shadow's role in repetition compulsion. Alright, so in today's video we're going to be talking about the shadow's role in repetition compulsion. So I'm first going to explain for you a little bit about what the shadow is and a little bit about what repetition compulsion is. Alright, so what the shadow is in a nutshell is it's kind of the blind spot of the psyche. So if we could think about the shadow as being like a dark closet in the psyche where we fragment off parts of ourselves, parts of our personality, and we push them into this dark closet to go unconscious to them. And when these aspects are pushed into the shadow, we truly are unconscious to them, but they still play out in an autonomous way underneath the surface of consciousness and might have a tendency to pull us into situations that we don't consciously want to be in. And I like to call these parts of ourselves that we push into the dark closet of the shadow our shadow aspects. And these shadow aspects are very much 100% you, and they have their own wants and needs and wisdom and boundaries, oftentimes that are separate from the wants and needs and boundaries and wisdom of your conscious personality. So they're almost like their own mini personalities that are existing in the unconscious, but they're still 100% you at the same time. It's just that you've lost consciousness to your own connection with those parts of yourself. All right, so that's the shadow in a nutshell. So let me explain to you a little bit about what repetition compulsion is. So what repetition compulsion is our tendency to unconsciously set up the same types of traumatic situation as we've experienced in the past, and to do this again and again and again in hopes of gaining control over the situation or getting a different outcome. For example, let's say that in childhood, John had a chronically unmet need where his parents were invalidating. And what he might have a tendency to do through repetition compulsion is to try to seek out an equally invalidating romantic partner or equally invalidating friends or an equally invalidating work situation where he can essentially try to right the wrongs of the past. But what oftentimes ends up happening is he just repeats the same pattern over again. So let's take it in, let's say an example of let's say that John gets attracted to a woman named Allie, and he gets into a relationship with this woman named Allie. And the reason that John was really attracted to her is because her dynamic was very, very similar to his parents' dynamic, where they were invalidating and wouldn't give him the validation. And then Allie also had this tendency to invalidate and not give him the validation either. And so what the pattern from childhood is that he's looking for validation from his parents, and his parents won't give him the validation. And let's say he's trying to get into a relationship with Allie. It's like, okay, she is an invalidating person, like the parents are, and in hopes of getting her to validate him, which would be tantamount to having his parents validate him. And when repetition compulsion happens, there's often a transference dynamic where we're transferring our feelings about one person or one situation onto another person or situation in hopes of getting a different result. So in John's case, when he becomes attracted to Allie and gets in the relationship with Allie, he's transferring his parents onto her because she becomes this perfect projection screen for his parents because she has that similar quality of being an invalidating person. And so now John has transferred those feelings about his parents onto Allie, and he's going through this process with her of trying to get her to validate him. And so if it was the case with the parents, okay, I need their validation, they won't validate me, he's hoping to get to a place of, oh, I need her validation and she will validate me. That's what he's hoping to get to. But if he is attracted to a person who is invalidating, what's going to happen is he's going to go back through that same cycle again and again. Oh, I want Allie to validate me. Oh, she won't validate me. I want Allie to validate me. She won't validate me. And so this is what happens with repetition compulsion, where we have this transference dynamic and we try to move through a similar situation from earlier on when we experienced a trauma or unmet need, and to try to create a different situation and to try to close the loop on the original situation. All right, so in terms of the relationship between the shadow and repetition compulsion, going back to what I had said earlier about the shadow, of how we tend to fragment off parts of our personalities and relegate them to the unconscious so that we forget about those parts of ourselves. And those parts go through the same pattern again and again and again. So whenever it's the case that we repress these aspects, they actually stay in a state of arrested development, and they stay stuck in the moment of the trauma or the moment of the chronically unmet need from earlier on in life. So let's say if we go back to John's example of being invalidated by his parents and not being able to get the need met for validation. And so the loop that John's shadow aspect is going through, so let's say that he had to repress this part of himself when he was 6 years old that needed to be validated by his parents, but because there was no ability to get that need met, and any attempt at seeking validation would be met with invalidation, which also would be traumatizing, he now had to split this part of himself away into the unconscious. And now it's like this 6-year-old part of himself, if this happened when he was 6, is stuck at that same age, at that same level of development, looking for that same need over and over again. And this 6-year-old part of him is saying, oh, I need my parents' validation. I need my parents' validation. I need my parents' validation. Now, consciously, John feels quite aversive to getting his parents' validation. And in fact, if his parents even tried to validate him, he would feel pretty gross about it, and he would feel pretty awkward and uncomfortable with it. But there's still this 6-year-old aspect of him that's down in the shadow that still wants the parents' validation, even though consciously he has so many different resistances to that. And so his parents become an outlet that he can't seek that validation through. And so what happens is that this aspect of him, from the perspective of the shadow, needs to find someone to transfer those feelings about the parents onto, so that John can actually engage with these feelings, because John consciously has a lot of different blocks to even thinking about his parents that way. And so what the shadow aspect does is it strategically waits for a partner like Allie, or like a friend, or even a work situation or some other life situation that reminds this aspect enough of his parents, so that that aspect can then sort of transfer those feelings about the parents onto that other person, to get John as the conscious personality to tune into its own pattern of looping. So you see, this aspect is unconscious from the perspective of John's conscious personality, but this aspect can manipulate John back into the same loop that it's in hopes of getting John to turn inward and to face with that part of himself, so that this aspect can actually resolve things and move forward with its life. And so what it's trying to do is it's using every tool in its arsenal, which are very limited, to try to get John to set up the same exact situation again and again and again, in hopes of being able to integrate, in hopes of moving past that moment, so that this aspect can get out of this broken record situation where it's looping around and around and around with the I need the validation, I need the validation, I need the validation pattern. And so when it comes to the relationship between the shadow and repetition compulsion, the shadow is the reason why we're going through repetition compulsion in the first place. And if you want to learn more about this, I actually have a video called Looping, where I talk about this tendency to, our shadow aspects to loop around in the same dynamic again and again and again. All right, so I wanted to mention that I have a new group coaching program called Shadow Work for Self-Sabotage. That's for ambitious people who want to use shadow work to overcome things that hold them back from reaching their goals. And if that describes you and you think you might be interested in enrolling during the pre-enrollment period, which is going on between now and July 20th, go ahead and click the link down below in the description box, and you can schedule a call on my Calendly. All right, so now getting back into the video, so we see that when we have these aspects that are relegated to the unconscious, they're stuck in a state of arrested development at the same age and the same moment that they were repressed, and they stay stuck like a skipping CD or a broken record, going through the same exact dynamic over and over and over again. So in John's case, it's I need the validation from my parents, I need the validation from my parents, I need the validation from my parents. And because we're unconscious to these parts of ourselves, these patterns continue continue to go on and on and on and on until we turn inward and we face with that part of ourselves and we actually meet that need from the inside. Now, when these aspects are doing this, what their goal is integration. What their goal is to get you as the conscious personality to tune into it so that you can actually integrate that part. But oftentimes this doesn't happen. Most of the time, this dynamic goes totally haywire and it's just a repeat of the original trauma over and over and over again. So the desired results are very, very different from the actual results that you can expect in this repetition compulsion dynamic. And so the desired results from the perspective of this aspect of yourself that's in the shadow causing the repetition compulsion, this aspect is trying to close the loop on an earlier situation so that you can actually move past the repetition compulsion. So if in the case of John, it's like, oh, I need validation from my parents, I'm going to try to get validation from my parents, oh, I can't get validation from my parents. And so what this aspect would be trying to do is to try to go through the same pattern of I can't get validation from my parents, let me try to get validation from my parents, and oh look, I got validation from my parents. To try to close that original loop so that it's not like going back through that same pattern over and over and over and over again. So that's the desired result, is to close that loop and to actually get out of the repetition compulsion. And that's that very tendency that tends to lead us right back into the repetition compulsion. Because instead of actually going through the loop and closing the loop, we just end up repeating the loop over and over and over and over again. Like I said, like a broken record or a skipping CD. So if John gets into a relationship with a partner who's equally invalidating, it's, oh, I need the validation from my parents, I'm going to try to get validation from my parents, I wasn't able to get validation from my parents, and it's, oh, I need validation from this invalidating partner, oh, I'm going to try to get validation from this invalidating partner, and then the typical results is, oh, I can't get validation from this invalidating partner. And again, the same pattern plays out again and again. And one thing that's important to note here with the example of John seeking out an equally invalidating partner is that John very likely won't even be interested in a partner that's going to validate him by default, because that doesn't set up the same scenario as before. You know, it doesn't build the same structure as before. So the story John wants to go through is, oh, I can't get the validation from this person, oh, and oh, look, I did this thing and now I can get the validation. That's the hope of the story that he can go through. And so he needs an invalidating partner, an invalidating person to play through that story again. So if he finds somebody who, you know, is interested in him, that is validating, chances are he's just not going to feel that interested in getting close to that person in the same way that he would feel towards somebody who actually has those similar patterns of invalidation. Ultimately, what John wants is a partner or a friend or another situation where he can persuade the invalidating person to validate him, because that's what feels like it would close the loop for him. Whereas somebody who's already validating, there's no loop there to close. So those are the desired results and the expected results. 99.99% of the time, if you're in repetition compulsion, you're not going to end up with good results. You're just going to end up repeating the same patterns, re-traumatizing yourself, and ending up in the same cycle over and over again. But to get the desired results, you actually have to go against your instincts a little bit. And instead of seeking to play things out in the external world, you have to tune into yourself and see how these dynamics are playing out in your internal world. And essentially what these shadow aspects are doing is they're trying to externalize your internal situation so that you can almost unconsciously move through this ritual in hopes of shifting the internal dynamic. But that ultimately doesn't work out, because the only way that ritual can really work is if you're consciously doing a ritual. You know, so a ritual is like an external sort of action or situation that you're engaging with in hopes of sort of making an internal shift. You know, so for example, if we take the graduation ritual, it's meant to give you an internal shift, basically by, you know, going through the process of walking down the aisle and getting your diploma and shaking the dean's hand. And this whole process is meant to catalyze an internal shift for you, and that's the entire point of the ritual. And the ritual works out pretty well because ultimately you're actually consciously engaged in the ritual. When you're unconsciously engaged in a ritual, like in the example of John here, where he's playing out this externalized situation of his internal situation, that's not actually going to create the shift. And so with John, instead of looking outward, he's going to want to look inward, and he's going to want to notice how he might be having a tendency to invalidate himself. And so if what he's looking for is to have the external invalidating person validate him, he needs to notice the way that he's invalidating himself and to be able to turn inward toward that part of himself that he's invalidating. So what the situation was before in childhood is that he would seek validation from his parents and his parents would invalidate him, right? And that was the dynamic, the problem dynamic he was dealing with at the time, because he really had those external needs. But oftentimes what happens is that we'll internalize the ways that our parents or caregivers were relating to us as children. And so now he probably has an aspect of himself, one of his shadow aspects, that's the invalidated part, and his conscious personality is acting as this invalidator. So he's probably going through a constant cycle of this part of him seeking validation from him and him invalidating that part. And now he plays through that dynamic externally with another person in hopes of bringing him back into connection with that invalidated part of himself. But what oftentimes ends up happening is that he just keeps trying to seek the validation in the external as opposed to actually giving himself validation in the internal. So let's say that John has a tendency whenever he feels a strong emotion, maybe consciously he rationalizes himself out of it and he minimizes it and he invalidates his feelings. If that's his internal pattern, what he wants to do is he wants to actually make a shift in the internal pattern that's causing him to want to look outward for that sense of validation from another person. And he wants to find the ways that he's internalized the invalidating nature of his parents and turn that inward towards himself. And ultimately, when you notice yourself going through a repetition compulsion and engaging in a particular pattern, you want to do a bit of a pattern interrupt and actually turn your attention inward. So if we think about, like, let's say us being a projection screen, and we can kind of project things onto certain people and transfer those like feelings about earlier situations onto other people. Instead of looking at the projected image, we want to look back at the projector itself, because that's where we can actually create the shift. We cannot create a shift by engaging with the projected image. Alright, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you liked the video, go ahead, give me a thumbs up and leave me a comment down below. Also, if you are interested in meeting with me on a discovery call for my new Shadow Work for Self-Sabotage group coaching program, go ahead and click the link down below in the description and schedule a meeting with me on my Calendly. And yeah, if you want to learn more about shadow work and like that process called looping, go ahead and click this link right here. And so this is another angle to look at shadow work and repetition compulsion from. All right, and until next time, keep becoming more you.